start our introductions. I want to welcome everybody to the Extension Disaster Education Network's monthly webinar. This month, I am lucky enough, my name is Carrie McKillop, and I will be facilitating the webinar today. And I'm lucky enough to get to introduce three of my colleagues, one in my own unit, to talk about preparing the urban canopy for weather-related disasters. You know, many of us live in small communities with lots of trees, and they can often cause some interesting situations in some of the high wind events that we get here in Illinois. And I'm sure most of you also across the nation have those kind of situations arise. So our presenters today are Chris Enroth, Sarah Vogel, and Ryan Pankau. Chris is the horticulture educator for Unit 10, which is Knox, Warren, Henderson County in West Central Illinois. He has a bachelor's degree in plant and soil science, specializing in landscape horticulture from Southern Illinois University, Carbondale, and earned his master's of landscape architecture at Kansas State University. He is responsible for the horticulture programming in Henderson, Knox, McDonough, and Warren counties, with an emphasis on the home gardener, landscape maintenance personnel, commercial landscapers, and including both adults and youth. Sarah Vogel is the horticulture and natural resource educator in DeWitt, Macon, and Piatt counties. She specializes in annuals and perennials, greenhouse production, landscaping, and urban forest management. She has a bachelor's degree also from SIUC in forestry with a concentration in recreation management, and a master's degree from University of Illinois in crop sciences with a concentration in horticulture. Sarah's passion is connecting with underserved populations in the community and fostering an appreciation for nature through education. And finally, Ryan Pankau is a horticulture educator in Champaign, and he previously worked as the area forester for the Natural Resources Conservation Service, NRCS, covering southern 30 counties of Illinois. Ryan's background is primarily in arboriculture and forestry, including stream and wetland restoration. And he has also worked as an arborist in Champaign, providing all the aspects of residential tree care, such as disease diagnosis, pruning, tree planting, and the care of newly planted trees. So I am pleased to turn it over. I believe Sarah is going to be our first presenter today. If you have questions, put them in the chat, and we will cover those at the end of the presentation. And, you know, we'll try to get everything covered at the end, and it is being recorded, so if you have to hop off early, you'll be able to go back to it. So take it away, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Carrie, for the introductions, and thank you all for joining us today for weather-related disasters in regards to preparation of the urban canopy. You're welcome at any time to type questions in the chat. I think we've decided the general consensus is we'll get to questions all at the end. So if you want to specify what you may be talking about in a certain slide, that will be helpful. So just starting out, when it comes to the urban canopy, you know, we aren't necessarily talking about big cities. We're talking about anywhere that kind of humans and trees exist at the same time. So this is yards, you know, parks, things like that. And one of the most important step, I think, is site and species selection. You want to put the right tree in the right site, and especially if you are working in, you say, a municipality, or you're an industry professional, this is going to come into play a lot for you. So when we talk about the right tree for the right site, first we want to take into consideration what our site characteristics are. So what's the climate like there? You want to make sure you're planting something hardy that's going to come back from year to year. Obviously, the soil type, pH, soil fertility, things of that nature. We try to pound into people to get a soil test so you know what your existing site has there. What the planting site is like. Are you on a slope? Is there varying topography there? What are the existing plantings around it? That can come into play in terms of diversity. So, you know, if there's 100 maple trees on your block, maybe you plant something different or choose another species. And then what's the maintenance going to be like? Is this going to be a tough species to get to maintain? And then, of course, once you have your site conditions taken into consideration, you also then want to take into consideration the species characteristics. So when you're talking about planting a tree somewhere, you certainly want to take into consideration the mature size of that tree. I think that's something that's often overlooked. We think this is going to be a nice little tree in our front yard, and all of a sudden we've got something overgrown that we can't maintain any longer. What that growth habit is it fast growing, slow growing? What the tolerance is of that tree species in terms of drought tolerance or poorly or well-drained soil tolerance. Some trees don't like wet feet, so you have to keep that in mind as well. What's the light requirements? Is it an understory tree, like say a dogwood? You may not want to plant certain species in full sun. Disease resistance and insect resistance, you know, new cultivars of things are bred all the time to be more disease resistant, which is great. So that is certainly something you'd want to take into consideration before choosing a species. Any known problems? For instance, there are some tree species that are known to have these codominant stems, and we'll show you some graphics of exactly what we're talking about with that in a windstorm, those codominant stems will split apart because of that point of weakness in there. So there are some species that do have some known problems like that. And then, of course, what are the maintenance requirements of this tree? Does it need to be pruned or sheared or whatever all the time? Does it have shallow roots that may not be great for a heavily utilized park environment? And then some of the attributes that some trees will have in terms of, does it flower? Does it fruit? Does it smell nice? Is it an allergen? So these are just some things we take into consideration when choosing the right plant for the right site. So this should dictate, the site conditions and tree characteristics should dictate what the species selection is. So then if you are an industry professional, or perhaps you work for a parks department or municipality, this might be more how you choose. So we have all those environmental factors that I've mentioned, and the species factors, and those come into play. But then in places like parks, you also have to take into consideration how much, how often, how frequently people are going to be on that site. Take into consideration, well, the cultural factors I have listed here. That's good information for a homeowner as well. Utility lines, sight lines, underground lines, how close it is to a road or a walkway, because remember, those might get salted in the winter and some species will not tolerate that very well. And again, the social factors in a place like a park, you'll have to think about different things than you might in a yard or home landscape. So these are kind of all things that factor into what your species selected is. And I know hopefully you're thinking at this point, well, what does this have to do with, disaster preparedness? Well, everything. If you start right from the beginning and take those proper steps, hopefully you don't have to do as much, reactive preparation. So once we have our site and our species selected, then we talk about installation and establishment. This is planting the tree, right? We want to use proper planting techniques because those will greatly improve the chances of survival. You can buy trees in many different ways. You can get bare root, you can get balled and burlap, you can get container stock. Each of these are going to have pros and cons, you know, whether it's cost, whether you got to wait a while for it to grow. So those are all factors in which, you know, that'll factor into your decision there. Also, staking and guying, you can see from the picture here, sometimes are not necessary. You know, if you're in some conditions, you may find them necessary, but they aren't always. In fact, you can see from the picture here that this tubing is causing a little bit of damage on the bark of this tree, and that's going to open a wound to the tree that will then be a potential source of pests or pathogen. You know, an open wound is not good. Another thing we talk about in terms of tree care is creating scaffolding. And what we mean by that is while the tree is young, that's the best time to prune it to create the branching structure that will cause for the best structural integrity, I guess I should say. Getting it started young so we don't have those codominant stems, so we don't have two branches coming out of one spot, and kind of avoiding those problems while young will help the tree out in the future. Say no to mulch volcanoes. If you've been working for extension, hopefully you've heard that from our team at some point. No mulch volcanoes. We do encourage the use of mulch, or at least I do. There's a lot of benefits to using mulch. You suppress weeds, you keep in moisture, you're adding organic matter back to the soil. However, you do want to keep the mulch a few inches away from the trunk of the tree, because again, to have the mulch right up against the bark of the tree is going to cause for a dark, damp environment that things like fungus and bacteria really like too. Watering a newly planted tree adequately is extremely important for the first several years even. And so, you know, our kind of rule of thumb is that most plants want an inch of water per week. So if you aren't getting at least that amount of rainfall, I would suggest watering on top of that. Especially newly planted trees, they're going to want a little bit more. There are several ways to accomplish that too. There's products made out there that can help you slowly release water so you're not out there dragging a hose around all the time. And so suffice it to say that these proper techniques early on are going to improve the longevity of the tree. So now perhaps those of you that may work in a park-like setting or have mature trees on your property are like, okay, well, I'm past that point. Now, what about the big trees that I already have there, right? Take into consideration that, and I'm sure I can speak for Ryan and Chris on this too, we get a lot of tree questions. I mean, a lot of tree questions. And one of the main points I try to drive home is that the environmental conditions, sometimes what we are doing around the trees is what's affecting them. It may not be a bacterial or fungal pathogen. It may be environmental. You know, if you've recently installed a driveway right next to the tree and taken out part of those roots, that's going to impact the health of the tree, right? If maybe you didn't build the driveway, maybe you just have a driveway there and that tree's been growing there this whole time. A tree's roots spread 2 to 3 times beyond the crown of the tree. So if you're constantly driving over it, and I say driveway, but mower wheels, footprints, I mean, even small things like that can cause soil compaction. So just some things to take into consideration. Most of these problems are environmental, and that includes soil compaction, drought, you know, here in central Illinois, that is an expectation most summers. You know, there's going to be a point at which drought conditions are likely. Moisture fluctuation, temperature fluctuation, mechanical injuries. So again, taking the mower right around the tree where your deck's hitting it, you're damaging that bark and possibly the cambial layer that makes it hard for a tree to survive or thrive, I should say. So you also want to pay attention to the amount of lawn treatments that you do. herbicides, sometimes even fertilizer, excessive fertilization can cause harm to some trees. So, you know, when you're putting things down on the lawn, it's not just affecting the lawn. So some things to remember there. It's rarely ever one issue that is affecting the health of the tree. It's typically a whole combination of things, those environmental factors, possibly some other pathogens or insects. Oftentimes, when people see an insect infestation, they might think, oh my gosh, these insects are killing my tree. But however, the insects are often secondary. They often come in and to already stressed trees after they've seen drought and soil compaction and all those other things. You'll start to see insects. So the important thing is, again, your species selection, keeping your trees healthy and looking at them, just going out there and seeing, you know, scouting for different things. What does that tree look like? Does it look healthy? Does it look as healthy as it did last year? Is there anything that's different now? So what do you look at when you're scouting for anything? This is a photograph of some probably pretty extensive root rot, basal decay around there. If I saw this tree and I knew there was a storm coming, I would be like putting money on it that tree's going over. You know, that's just something to look for. You want to first correctly identify what your species is. You know, if you've already got a mature tree, whether it's your yard or in a park setting, public setting, correctly identify the tree. That's going to help when you do call extension or an arborist or whatever the case is. That's going to help them diagnose more accurately. Look for patterns. What's normal for the plant? I talked about some of the biotic versus abiotic. So biotic is living factors. That would be our bacterial and our fungal pathogens, where our abiotic or non-living factors are those environmental conditions. Maybe the tree was planted too deeply and it's taken 15 years for symptoms to show up. So just kind of keeping in mind maybe a timeline or a history of how that tree's been surviving this entire time or its entire life. Is the site, you know, near a road? Again, salt can impact the health of a tree. New construction can impact the health of a tree, or at least the root zone of it. Are there the same species nearby? Perhaps there is a pathogen that's going from one place to another there. You want to examine the foliage or the leaves. If this is where an issue occurs, you want to think about the time of year. There are some pathogens that we see from year to year about the same time. For instance, during May and June, I will get calls here, and even in my life before extension, I'm going to get anthracnose calls. People are going to call about certain things at the same time of year, so there are patterns that'll happen there. You want to examine the trunk and branches. Look for wounds, look for open spots, look for insect boring holes. Look for water sprouts. And when we say water sprouts, these are those little suckering sprouts that maybe come out of the trunk or the base of the trunk. Places that are other than the ends of the branches. That's an indication that the tree is not as healthy as it wants to be, or it's under some kind of stress. Okay. And then examine the roots and the root collar. If you see any fungal growth or mushrooms, that is probably an indication that there is decay present. Because if you think back to 5th grade science there, mushrooms are decomposers, right? So that's exactly what they're doing. There's some decay present. And if you see fungal growth, that is an indication of not being healthy. So when we're talking specifically about assessing a tree that might be a hazard, this is kind of your risk management, right? So you're out there checking out your trees. Is there even a potential for tree failure? Is this tree healthy? You know, or has it been dying back? Has it been dropping limbs? Maybe it didn't leaf out this year. Maybe it didn't leaf out on a third of it. For a tree to really be a hazard tree, there has to be the potential for failure. There has to be a potential target. and maybe an environment, for instance, a storm that would create that environment for failure. So, you know, if there's a storm coming and you've got a dead tree, but it's out in the middle of nowhere, if it falls, it's not going to hurt anything. That's not really a hazard, right? Because it doesn't pose a risk to person or property. Defects and faults. So again, codominant stems, and I'll show you in the next slide here what that is all about. If you see dead branches in the canopy, you know, in a storm or even high winds, those dead branches could come down and potentially injure something or someone. Look for cracks and splits. Perhaps there are prior improper pruning practices that aren't sealing correctly. Perhaps there's been a grade change or some construction around there. The presence of decay, any kind of decay, means that that tree has lost some of its strength. So in terms of risk abatement, again, those proper installation methods, those proper establishment methods, and pruning methods, those are all going to be really important in the health of your tree. Good management and monitoring, getting out there and seeing what that urban canopy looks like. Maybe that looks like an inventory. And I don't mean necessarily counting every single tree and measuring every one. Having a good idea, well, about 20% of our trees are, for instance, ash trees. You know, when emerald ash borer came through, the city of Chicago had something like 20% of their street trees that were ash trees. That's a lot of money in removal and then replanting. So just to know what's out there can also help, you know, if you're working under a budget. So these are some good graphics of what I'm talking about with codominant stems. You know, generally we want to see a tree with one straight central leader and scaffold-like branches coming off of that leader. Okay, and that's what we train them for. When I say train them young, the pruning procedures when they're young, we want to avoid things like these codominant stems, because as these two stems get older and grow in diameter, they're growing into each other. And so this area here is what's called included bark. And it is a weak point. It makes the tree less structurally sound and is a prime spot for breaking apart there, splitting out in high wind conditions. So perhaps you have experienced a storm event and you did have a tree split out or lose limbs. What then? You know, first I want to say, hire a professional when that's necessary. Don't try to DIY, you know, big tree removals if that is something beyond your capabilities. You want to try and prune or remove dead and broken branches if you can. There are some preventative measures like cabling or bracing that Ryan could probably speak more to, but these are just some of the factors you could take into consideration there. Was the tree healthy to begin with? Are there major limbs broken or just small ones? Is the main stem gone? You know, do you have 50% or more? Or how big are those wounds? If you were to prune off the parts that are broken, would the remaining portion be structurally sound? So then you want to make a decision and reduce any future risk, you know, by making good decisions there. And with that, I will turn it over.
All right, thank you, Sarah. Let's see how I have control here. So what us at Extension do, we have a program here in Illinois where we are training our Master Gardener volunteers to help out other municipalities, other organizations in tree inventories. And part of that is identifying trees that are at risk, whether it's a storm or some type of a wind-related or natural disaster. And so there's a big list of things, but we narrowed them down to 7 things that we train our volunteers to identify trees. So when they're helping out with doing an inventory, they can point to this tree, they can mark it down, and they can say, this tree needs to be assessed further by a certified arborist. It could pose a hazard. And when we talk about preparing our urban canopy for potential disasters, these are things that to look for. And if I would just back up a little bit, oh, wrong way. I'm really going to harp on this codominant stems. Where I see failure so many times is right here. And so consider this a bonus number 8, and then a bonus number 9, look how deep that tree is planted. It's too deep. You can't see the root flare. Those are things we also train our volunteers, but I don't include them in this 7 things here. So back to the 7 list here. But I mean, one of the first telltale signs here is that you see dead wood up in the canopy. And dead wood can be observed as you can see the bark peeling or sloughing off. You know, when you see that, that limb is dead. The tissue has died. It has released that bark canopy from there, and this is a dead limb. Now, what would happen, say a strong wind comes through, breaks off that limb, it might fall to the ground, or it hangs there in the canopy. Now, there's a reason why in the industry, these are called widowmakers, is because those hanging limbs pose a severe, significant risk to people below. So whether it's in the backyard, especially if it's in a park or a public place or a client's that you would manage, deadwood is a dead giveaway. You need to have this tree either assessed by if it's an arborist that you have on staff, or contacting a certified arborist to come and manage this and remove those limbs, whether they use a bucket truck or they climb up there to take care of the issue. Now, we saw a similar picture with this that Sarah had referenced to before, but so when I'm looking at trees, I look up in the canopy looking for deadwood, and then my eyes go down to the base of the tree, and I'm looking for outward signs of rot, any type of structural weakness, decay. And a lot of times, as Sarah mentioned, this manifests as the fungal fruiting bodies, mushrooms, whether it's a shelf fungus that's growing on the trunk itself, or mushrooms that are popping up along the base here of this oak tree. And you know, you can see the decay that has occurred. Why has it decayed? Again, all manner of reasons. Could be rodents, could be lawnmower disease, which is just lawnmowers and string trimmers hitting the base of this tree. Lots of things can injure the base of that tree, which opens up an avenue or vector for pathogens, rot pathogens specifically that we're looking at. So you're going to look for fungal fruiting bodies. You're looking for hollows. I've actually just did a site visit of a silver maple, and there was a hollow cavity in the middle, but it was actually caused by codominant stems up higher in the tree. So there were critters living in the hollow. They thought, do I need to get rid of the critters that are causing this damage? Like, no, actually, it's the codominant stems causing it. You pretty much have to cut your tree down to get rid of it. So, so look for that. You're going to look for splits, cracks in the tree. It could be caused by lightning, but sometimes it's caused by natural growth. So again, that's why a certified arborist, someone who deals with this every single day, is really good and handy to have come out with their trained eye and take a look at these things. And then as I'm looking at the base of the tree, I am watching the root zone. I'm seeing how, you know, sometimes if it's a newly planted tree, can it give me some signs of some issues when this tree was planted? Now, this picture here was taken in a park near Quincy, Illinois, and all of the trees were exhibiting the same sign. See that root circling around the base of that tree? That is called a girdling root. All these trees, I would say about 24 in total, had a girdling root. In this case, the root was wrapped all the way around the trunk of the tree. Now, we often think like, oh, well, trees, you know, they just grow into each other. You know, the tissue just magically grows into each other. That's not how it works. The root tissue and stem tissue or vegetative tissue are two different things. And they don't just grow into each other. Now, as you can see here, the trunk is expanding and the roots are also expanding, and now they have come into conflict or contact with each other, and the roots are effectively strangling that tree. It's cutting off the supply of carbohydrates and sugars from the leaves down to the roots, and it's cutting off the supply of water, nutrients from the roots up to the leaves. And this tree is dying. There's very little, I would say at this point, that can be done at this tree. And as Sarah mentioned, you know, in a windstorm, where's that failure going to take place? Well, probably right there where that girdling root is occurring. There's just a lot of issues here with girdling roots, and we could probably go on for a long time about this because a lot of it takes place before the tree is usually even planted in the ground. So again, that proper planting, that site selection, that species selection, those are critical components to failures that occur here 10 to 15, maybe 20 years down the road. And I also look at the leaf size and color. Now, very often you can tell a tree is under stress by if the leaves are maybe a bit off color. They're not a deep green or a dark green, or maybe they're a diminished in size. But you have to know your species. So pictured up top, there's actually a catalpa tree. Now they have kind of an off-colored lime chartreuse type green leaf. Some people might look at this and say, ooh, there might be a nutrient deficiency or this tree is under stress, but no, this is just the natural leaf color of the tree. So you have to be able to kind of identify this species by species basis. Now the picture on the bottom, I actually don't have a picture of the canopy, but so often I can walk up to a tree and I can say like, oh, the canopy or the leaves of this canopy, you can tell they're stunted, the leaves aren't as big, maybe they're off color, but pictured here is actually a hackberry. And what was happening here, and by the way, hackberries are tough trees. It's tough to, to hurt a hackberry. But what was happening here is the homeowner had called us and he was very concerned because the canopy or the leaves were much smaller than in past years. Focusing on the canopy. So we couldn't figure it out on the phone. So I went and did a visit here and I found, as we pulled all the suckers away from the base of the tree, a tomato cage. He had placed that tomato cage there to keep the deer away from the tree and had forgotten about it. And so what had caused that diminished leaf? Well, it was nothing. There was no insect. There was no disease. It was because there was a tomato cage at the base of this tree that was like that girdling root strangling this tree. There was no remedy for this situation, unfortunately. So there's a lot of issues, stress, as Sarah mentioned, caused by us humans. So being able to identify and go in there and look closely at a tree. Now we can also look at annual growth. And so pictured here, you can see this is called a bud scale scar at the terminal end. Terminal end just means the tip of the branch. So that's where the tip of the branch was the year before. And the scar wraps all the way around the stem. Now we can go back in time and we can see where the tip of the branch was the year before. And maybe the year before that, we can go back in time a few years. Now, if we start to see, if I scroll ahead here, so we can measure out the growth that occurs here. Now, if we start to see growth that's maybe an inch, half inch, we know that tree did not grow well that year. Now, yes, this is very species dependent, but for the most part, if we start seeing very minuscule growth occurring year to year between those two bud scale scars, we know that there's some stress that's occurring. This tree is not growing as it should. A lot of times this is an indicator of drought. A lot of times it could be an indicator of some type of construction damage that occurred a few years prior. But it's very interesting how we can go back in time and see how this tree grew a few years in the past. So that's another indicator that stress is occurring, another thing that we train our volunteers to look for. Now, kind of in that same vein, that annual growth, we're back to this picture here of this tree getting strangled to death by its own root system. Now, a lot of folks will call the office and they'll say, hey, I have all of this stuff growing on the trunk of my tree and it's killing it because my tree looks terrible. Is it in fact killing the tree? Well, pictured here is actually lichens. They are growing on the trunk of this tree. Now, typically what happens for an annual growth cycle for a tree, yes, lichens or moss can grow on the tree, but the tree grows, it expands, it can shed some of that material off. I know when I see a mat of lichens like this, that tree is probably not growing to the way it should be. So not always, because sometimes lichens, and moss, they just accumulate on the north side of a tree. But I definitely see in this case where I see lots of lichen growth, it's indicating to me there is some problem with this tree that is not growing, is not expanding as it should be. And it's an indicator. It is not a cause. It's cluing me in that there's something else going on with this tree. And the other thing that we see very, very commonly is competition with other plants, as Sarah mentioned. Competitions, mature spacing. This is a huge factor. So this is another thing that we train our volunteers to identify. However, for the most part, the main competition is rootgrass. Again, Sarah had mentioned the tree's roots can spread 3 to 5 times the width of that canopy. Now, we often think trees grow these big old tap roots. Well, that's really not often the case. Yes, they do have tap roots that can go down, but for the most part, the majority of the root system is spreading horizontally, occupying the same root zone as our turf grass for the most part. And actually, one study out of Morton Arboretum showed that once they removed the turf grass from the root zone of a tree, they saw a 195% increase in root growth for that tree. So there's a lot of competition happening back and forth there. So mulch rings, as mentioned before, they are important. They are helpful in keeping your trees healthy. And finally, like the last thing, you would think this is the first thing I'm looking for, signs of pests. No, and again, as Sarah mentioned, this is usually a secondary cause. An insect or a disease comes in. But what happens when you pull an all-nighter working on a project, or you have a sick child keeping you up all night? It stresses you out, leaves you open to disease or an insect. Same thing with these species here with trees. So usually it is the environmental stress or the human-caused stress that creates these issues. Now, yes, there are always exceptions in nature. Nothing is definite. Emerald ash borer is one of those things that comes in and attacks a perfectly healthy ash tree. There's nothing we can do about it except treat the tree or cut it down. But then again, learning how to identify what type of stress you're looking at. Is it something that is abiotic, again, caused by maybe drought, or is it something biotic or something living that's occurring? And you can see here bur oak blight, oak wilt is kind of blowing up again here in central Illinois. And so are these issues what you're seeing? And so fortunately, for a lot of our states, we have land-grant universities that have plant clinics where we can submit things to help us distinguish between abiotic and biotic things. And so U of I, we have our University of Illinois Extension plant clinic on Champaign, on the Champaign-Urbana campus that you can submit samples to and hopefully distinguish between these two causes. Because that's a very important thing. I think Sarah and Ryan will agree. We get the phone call, hey, this bug's eating my tree. Well, actually, the bug's taking care of the damage that was caused by you leaving the staking material on or the codominant stems. So those 7 things, plus the codominant stems, plus the tree planting too deep, are those things that we train our volunteers to look for to help prepare our urban canopies to be more resilient. And to some of those action items here, Ryan will talk about pruning and maybe helping our trees out, lessening that load for our trees. So Ryan, you feel free to take over.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Requesting control there from you. And once again, I'd like to discuss some concepts in pruning trees. So with any kind of storm damage, whether it's in the summer or the winter, there's almost always some type of preventative pruning I could point to that could have in some way or another helped to prevent that or lessen the damage or address that ahead of time. So, while we do need to definitely correct this storm damage as it happens, some pruning ahead of time can do a lot to limit the extent of that damage in the event that we do have a storm come through. So any discussion of pruning kind of starts with just the basics of making, a good pruning cut on your tree. And believe it or not, there's, a method to this madness. There's a way that you should lop off the limbs on your tree, and it should be in a way where we kind of retain, what's called the branch collar tissue. So this little diagram here at the right shows, a limb that has been cut off here, and we've left this rumply little bit of bark, which is called the branch collar. So here's kind of a picture with a real live crabapple stem right here, where if we're going to make the proper pruning cut on this plant, we would actually make a cut right there. So we leave the branch collar tissue intact, where a lot of folks tend to want to cut a little more flush with the trunk. So where you're cutting right along the trunk, we remove some of this branch collar tissue. And so this branch collar is really important because it is the tissue that's there to react, to start to grow over or seal over that wound after we make a pruning cut. So here's another example on an ash tree where, that crabapple we looked at just a minute ago, that collar tissue is really easy to see. Most folks can really easily identify that. Where here on this ash tree, this is kind of the area of branch collar tissue right here. It's not as easy to identify. Here's kind of the proper pruning cut that somebody would have made there, where we've again left that branch collar tissue intact, where a lot of folks tend to do, this incorrect flush cut. And this is actually on an ash tree that was going to be removed. It was damaged by emerald ash borer. So I was able to go ahead and before I, for example purposes, make the incorrect cut here. But we'll see on the next slide here kind of how these wounds seal over. We say trees don't heal, they seal, because unlike humans, where our tissues can regenerate over time, trees don't do that. They actually just grow over any of these wounds we've made on them. So a lot of us have probably looked at trees around our community and seen these kind of things on tree limbs or branches. And so here we have on a red oak, a pretty well-made pruning cut. So, we've left this branch collar tissue intact. That's a pretty fresh cut because we don't see this, material starting to grow here like on this maple tree. This pruning cut was made with leaving the branch collar intact, and you can see this is the reaction the tree has to that pruning cut, where it starts to form what's called callus tissue that then is going to seal over that wound and seal out pathogens that can get into the trunk. So we can look at how symmetrical this callus tissue is after the fact, and it can tell us how much of that branch collar tissue we left intact or if we pruned a little bit too much off. Because if we prune some of that branch collar tissue off, then the tree doesn't have the cells there ready, the meristematic tissue, the growing points ready to start to initiate this callus tissue. So in this case, same red oak as you see pictured up here on the other side of the trunk was an older pruning cut. You can see it's not as symmetrical as the maple we see at the left there. So a little bit of that callus tissue has been inadvertently pruned off, or in this case, there's a bit of a defect right here. So that can be kind of affecting this irregular growth right here. But I would say chances are some of this callus tissue is actually pruned off. That cut was made a little bit incorrectly because we're not seeing a nice even donut, as a lot of folks describe this as kind of a little donut that forms. Here's a little bit younger of a cut on this sugar maple. But you can see a little bit more of the callus tissue was removed right here than on this side because we have a little bit more growth right there. So why do we care about that? Well, the longer we leave that wound open, the longer that area is vulnerable to attack by pathogens, by some of those biotic stresses that Chris and Sarah talked about. And this little figure here kind of shows if we had a wound right here, whether it was from something smashing into the trunk or us pruning off a limb and leaving an open area there, for all that time that's open and hasn't been sealed over, pathogens can get in and they readily spread up and down the trunk. The tree's defense mechanisms are more resistant to spread across the trunk and outward than up and down. So we see a lot of trees out in nature that are hollow all the way up. It's still standing and still healthy. That's just part of the way trees react to these. So by making proper cuts and allowing those to seal over quickly, we limit the ability of pathogens to get in and spread this rot either up and down the trunk or up and down a limb, where that leaves this stem that has some rot in there more vulnerable to storm damage. So that's why just a proper pruning cut is incredibly important. Here's an example of that red maple we looked at previously, where this was 2 years after that cut was made. Here's the sealing we see in the result of that cut. And here's 3 years post-cut, where we actually see that wound is completely sealed over. So at this point, pathogens cannot get in through what's left there. That tree is effectively grown callus tissue over and sealed over that wound, and that's kind of the ideal setting. That's what we want to see with the pruning cut, where if a flush cut had been made, if we cut off some of that collar tissue, we'd still see, some kind of open area that was vulnerable there on this plant and leaving it vulnerable to kind of attack. So this is another example of just kind of where a little stub was left. So this is probably on a tulip poplar. This is probably a limb that kind of died and naturally broke off there, but a common mistake a lot of folks make is leaving a stub and not pruning right at the collar. So you can see where this tree started to form that callus tissue right here because the collar was left intact. But to fully seal over this wound, think about the amount of time it takes for this little donut to grow all the way out and around this stub. One or two things are going to happen. It's going to either grow out and around it and encase this stub, as you see on the right on this white oak tree. It's done a really good job of naturally. This was in the Shawnee National Forest in Southern Illinois. I got this picture. It's just naturally had some limbs break off, and it's done a great job of kind of sealing over all those stubs that were just kind of naturally left there. The other thing that can happen is this can really start to rot and eventually fall off, which is great because the little donut can seal over, but it spread rot further back into the stem and kind of compromise the structural integrity of that plant. So we really want to get those pruning cuts made right at the proper point. Sarah kind of addressed this, and so did Chris, and we talked about kind of this concept of codominant stems, two stems that grow close together, but I kind of break these into two different categories of what I call a U-shaped branch attachment that's strong, where this is more of a U-shape. It's open right here. And this is what I'm calling a V-shaped branch attachment, where, as Sarah mentioned, it has what we call included bark right here, where that's bark that gets trapped right there between those two expanding stems and starts to cause some rot right there. And it can eventually lead to, as Chris mentioned, failure right at that point. So as an arborist that would be pruning your tree, one of my goals in pruning would be to move around the canopy of your tree and prune out as many of these narrow or V-shaped branch unions as I can with pruning to leave these stronger branch unions in place. So that's a major goal of pruning. So let's, here's a good example of another one of those limbs that's kind of broke out. This is on a Bradford pear, and they are notorious for very narrow V-shaped branch unions. So you can see there's one there, there's one there, there's one up here that's just outside of the picture, these really narrow attachment points. And here's an example of that included bark that starts to add some rot in here. You can see all those darker areas are rot and decay that's happened here that's caused this limb to fail apart. So as those, unfortunately, as Bradford pear or Callery pear gets much larger in size and they have bigger limbs and a bigger canopy to sport with those faulty branch unions, we see them kind of peel apart like a banana. I thought was a really great analogy an arborist that I used to work with would compare that to, and it really is true. They kind of just start to peel apart as these branch unions have more and more stress above them and more weight they have to support. So here's an example of a pignut hickory in my neighborhood that had a major part of its canopy, this whole chunk here that was not quite as tall as this other side. This whole chunk came out in a storm, and you can see a good example of a strange attachment here that was kind of a narrow branch attachment. There's some of that rot in there. If we look down on the top of this, we'd see a bunch of rot on the other side that has caused, a structural weakness here that when you add some wind to it, it can really, create a large failure of this trunk. So this is this is a plant that really needs to be assessed whether we keep this or not. It doesn't have a lot of, you can see it's not close to a house, so there's not a target underneath it, but I would say at least 50% of this tree probably came out in this storm event. And had we done some pruning up in this part of the canopy to reduce some weight, there's a good chance we could have prevented at least the severity of this break, if not prevented it entirely. So here's another example of another pignut hickory close to the last one you just saw pictured on the same property that has this really narrow branch union, and you can just almost see where this branch would peel off the trunk if enough wind was applied to this. Due to some shading, you can't quite see. There's a big silver maple here. Here's a blue spruce that's not doing so great. This branch union is right here, and this limb has been really suppressed by growth of other trees. So this is an excellent example of a limb that would be great to take off of this plant before it actually fails in a storm. It's not a huge part of the canopy, but we can really easily assess from the ground that this is not a good branch union. You can see where all that bark's kind of coming together. Here's another example of a sugar maple, where I have a blown up view of, this area of the trunk right here. Here we can see the front, and here we can see kind of the back of it, where you can see it's another example of a really narrow branch union with that included bark. And you can almost see where this would peel off, where, right down this line, it would probably split. And if that happened, we would lose just a major chunk of this canopy. Probably all this area through here is supported by this one branch union. So what are some of the things we can do preventatively with pruning to address that? Well, here's an example of some of the pruning cuts that I would go up there and try and make. And again, this is not something we should try at home. This is something that's probably needs to be left to a professional arborist when it's up in a tree. It's something that you need to get up there to do these pruning cuts. And I'll leave you with a slide that shows you where you can get in contact with some of those folks that do these kind of things. But this is just an example of a few of the pruning cuts I would make There's probably some more up in this area that I could also suggest, but in a 2D view of this, it's really hard to kind of show all that stuff. But the point of where these cuts are placed at is that they're really high up in this limb. And that's because the further away we get from this branch union, the more of a lever action we have on the actual branch union itself. So pruning higher up on this lever arm reduces more weight that's acting upon this branch union than if we took a lot out down here lower. And that's what I think a lot of folks try and do with pruning, is address a lot of it where it's easy to get at and lower down, but it's really this pruning up in the tips or up in the upper portion of this limb that really do the most to reduce the weight. Also, another benefit of this is that I would challenge a lot of folks to look at this plant after I pruned it and see if you could see where these limbs came out of. A lot of times when this is in full leaf out, it's really hard to even notice where those limbs have been pulled out of. They're kind of up there in the tips, and you can't see them from the ground as well. So another thing that we could follow up with is a supportive cable in there. So a cable is something that we attach, to this weakened stem and anchor it back to a main trunk. And what it does is it just doesn't allow the all these limbs to flex as much in a storm and move away from the main trunk. It sets a limit as to how far that can move. We allow for a little bit of natural movement still in the limb, but it doesn't allow it to separate enough where it starts to split apart this limb down here. And there's a number of different ways we can install cables, from metal and hardware that we actually drill and put a bolt through each stem, to nowadays there's some other different types of materials that have been developed that we don't actually have to drill holes. We can affix those cables where there's a branch union that we can attach them to, but typically they go about 2/3 of the way up from the branch union to the tips is where we install that cable. So it's pretty high up in the tree. I don't know if my mark here is, it's about approximately 2/3. It can maybe even be a little higher up, but cables are definitely something we do on the preventative side of things. Once we have storm damage in a tree that's been impacted, that's not the time we install a cable. It's not for something that has already started to fail. This is something, again, ahead of time in preparation for the wind stress that's put on this plant. We're going to prune, almost always what I recommend, pruning in conjunction with cable installation. And the last thing we can do to kind of strengthen it is down at these branch unions where they meet the trunk, we can actually put a giant through bolt through the stem. And in this case, this is really not a great candidate for a through bolt because we typically install those just a few inches above where these branches meet, and it would go all the way through the trunk. And as you can see, we have a lot of other branches here, a lot of other stuff going on. So in this case, I would probably recommend a combination of pruning and a cable higher up in the plant, but just due to the nature of this branch union, I probably wouldn't recommend a bolt down there, where other plants really would benefit from a bolt going through as another preventative measure. In this case, I think I would probably do a little more pruning up in the top because I don't have the capabilities of installing a bolt down there in conjunction with the cable to strengthen it. So here's another example. The last one we'll kind of look at here is a giant sycamore, just a beautiful old sycamore tree in the backyard of this home. And you can see we have this limb that just really goes out over the house. It's a little bit out of balance with the canopy, and concerns me that there's a lot of weight over a target here. So we have a home underneath just a lot of branch material right up here. If we inspected this branch union, here's what we would see in a little closer of a view, where that's one of those nice U-shaped wide open branch unions. And I've actually been up in this plant and I've looked at it from the top. That's really where the inspection needs to happen to fully assess the structural integrity of this branch union, is from the top, kind of looking down in there where I can see that included bark. I can see the extent of any of that rot and decay, because you can't always see that from the ground. But good looking branch union here. So I don't worry about necessarily bolting that area to strengthen it. Probably what I would look at is a combination of pruning and a cable here, where again, it's kind of hard to see in this picture, but there's one stem that I would leave that's not red back here behind the stem in front that's kind of red. They both meet right here. So I'd suggest taking out this big chunk right here that's going to alleviate a lot of weight. And again, this is up in the very tips of this plant. It's not any of this side stuff down here. It's not, this, I guess this limb's attached to the trunk in a different area, but it's out on the tips there where we get the most bang for our buck. For, each pound we removes that much more pounds of pressure back here on the branch union. A cable could go across, again, about 2/3 of the way up. all of these being kind of preventative measures to help limit the damage the damage from future storms. So when preventing storm damage, we definitely can't control the weather, but here are the options that we have. So we've talked about kind of that structural assessment of mature trees. So looking at those to see, where can someone, an arborist, identify from the ground some of those weak points in the canopy, and how can they be addressed either with pruning or cabling or bracing, a bolt at the base that could build up some of the strength there and limit the storm damage. Preventative pruning is the other big option as recommended by a certified arborist. So that gets me to the point of how you connect with some of these folks. If you yourself are not a certified arborist or don't have one on staff where you work, if you manage trees, there's a whole list of certified arborists, and that is a credential maintained by the International Society of Arboriculture. You can go onto their website right here and click on Find an Arborist, and the list of certified folks is searchable for your area. You can find a whole list of folks within a set search radius of your home that have the credentials necessary to assess these things in your tree and provide recommendations and even the pruning needed to correct or strengthen some of those issues. So with that, we'll go to some questions, but I do want to point out we do have a survey available for some feedback. I can see it's been dropped in the chat box quite a few times. Here's the, you can scan this QR code right here that would bring you to our survey, but we'd love to hear back from you on how effective our presentation was today, what types of things you'd like to hear about in a presentation like this. But with that, why don't we go to any questions that have came in? I guess I can kind of start us off with, I do see a question from Matt here. And so Matt wrote, how far from the base of the tree do the fungal fruiting bodies have to be to indicate a problem? And so I think that's probably in reference to, Chris, you shared a picture. That's actually from my house that Chris showed a picture of some fruiting bodies on some root structures. And I would say, when I look at that, try and assess that kind of problem, it's usually pretty close to the trunk that we're seeing those really, large fruiting bodies. It's on those bigger stems that it can actually get into and really start to cause some rot and decay. Where as I get further away from the trunk, and I'm seeing those, a lot of times it's, maybe a fungus that's in the mulch, that there's a lot of different things that kind of grow in mulch that really pretty harmless for the most part. Some of those type of fungi are the type that, actively decay already dead wood. They don't really attack live tissues. So a lot of the stuff I see in mulch, I don't worry about too much. So I'm really looking for stuff that's around the base of the tree. That picture, Chris and I like it so much because it's kind of unique to see some of those fruiting bodies away from the trunk a little ways. Usually, Chris mentioned shelf fungus, and those are fungi that are kind of forming flat shelves on the trunk. So we usually see this kind of on the trunk or at the base of the trunk and not so much out away from it. So I don't know, Chris or Sarah, would you guys have anything to add to kind of that answer or any other thoughts?
The only thing about I've noticed with ash trees, maybe everyone else has noticed this, there is a particular fungus, the fruiting body is a mushroom. It's kind of brown, leathery looking. I see that occurring. Usually trees are affected with emerald ash borer, but that clues me in, and it's out away from the base of the trunk. It's decomposing dead roots because when the EAB attacks the canopy, those roots no longer have anything to support. So why keep them around? And so that fungi goes in, and then you see that kind of brown leathery mushroom pop up every once in a while. So it kind of clues me in to look up in the canopy for dieback. But for the most part, mushrooms are not a bad guy. So yeah.
Yeah, I would only add that probably the closer you are to the trunk, the more trouble you may be in, generally speaking.
Yeah, very true.
So we have another question, Ryan, from Carrie. When is the best time to prune trees? You talked pruning, so when should we be doing this?
Yeah, that's a great question, Carrie. Probably the best time of the year, if you can ideally plan it, is in the winter time when they're dormant. We've all seen, all of our deciduous trees lose their leaves. They go dormant for the winter time. And so that's the best time. That's where we're going to have the least impact to, plant health. And really, if I can, I try and even plan that for late in the winter. So January, February, in the ideal world, that would be when you do all your pruning cuts, because again, all those wounds that you open up have to seal over. And if you do it early, like late, like in the fall or in the very early part of the dormant season, they're just left open that much longer before the growing season starts. So that's in an ideal world. Now, in reality, when does most of the world's pruning happen? It usually happens during the growing season. And that's when folks are out and active. That's when crews are out and active and doing it. And that's not a big issue if you have a really healthy tree. So, don't stress pruning during the growing season if you have a really healthy tree. It's those really stressed trees that just have to be pruned, that we try and really focus on that exact time of the year. If you have to look at what's the second best time of year other than like full-on dormancy, you really want to, you definitely don't want to prune. So the worst time of the world to prune is as trees are leafing out or as they're dropping their leaves, because there's a lot of changes happening in that plant. And we don't want to disturb that. Is probably the easiest explanation of that. So really the second best time then is once those plants have been able to leaf out in the springtime, and once those leaves have reached full size, really got their full size there, we can assume that plant has got enough energy return out of that full size leaf from photosynthesis from what it invested in the spring to grow it, that it's kind of broke even. So I usually describe that as being late June or so, that our trees have kind of leafed out. They've kind of got some energy from those leaves that you're going to prune off. And then you can prune those off, and it's kind of there's no loss in energy then. They've kind of gained back what they invested earlier in the spring, and it's kind of no loss. So so really either dormancy in the wintertime or from about late June all the way up to, sometime in August or September, we need to kind of stop pruning, probably by September for sure, because they're starting to go into the change where they start to lose their leaves, and we don't want to prune or disrupt them then. So that's kind of the best times and worst times.
Okay,
and I'm sorry, go ahead, Carrie.
I just wanted to say before we go on, and I will keep this going as long as we have questions, but just in case we have people that have to hop off right at 1 o'clock, I wanted to remind everybody to please fill out the survey. And this recording will be available on the extensiondisaster.net website once we have it edited down. So thanks everybody for participating, and I can't wait to hear the rest of the answers to these questions. So go ahead, Sarah.
Sure. So I was just going to add to Ryan's wonderfully thorough answer that some of the reasons that we suggest doing pruning at during the proper time is that otherwise you get weakly attached branches growing. And that's one of the things that are going to later on then be a potential for a hazard or, one of the widowmaker limbs. Mm-hmm. And it will vary too. Evergreens are not always the same as deciduous trees. So we might vary a little bit on timing then too. So we have kind of more specific timing for some evergreens as well.
Well, so Sarah, your comment there on weakly attached stems, that's a good one. And that segues nicely into our next question. And so what Sarah's talking about is that growth response the plant would have. So different times a year, we're going to have a lot of weakly attached stems in the growth response. But it looks like Angie has a question about, is it harmful to have trees topped? And yes, absolutely, because topping is a tree pruning. I don't even know if we can call it a tree pruning practice.
Tree hacking.
Yeah, hack job. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I had don't say no to mulch volcanoes, and I was very close to saying friends don't let friends top trees.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great saying or motto. So topping is a thing we do to trees where we haven't made horticulturally correct pruning cuts, like I described today at the branch collar. And there's a little bit of truth in the thinking behind why folks started to do this. It's an outdated practice that we used to do years ago that we now know science has showed us is not healthy for trees. But the idea is just that you're reducing that lever arm, that really tall limb that can act upon the branch union at the trunk. You're reducing the size of that, so you are taking a lot of weight out. That reduces the stress on that branch union at the trunk. But when we do that and we just cut in the middle of the stem, that's what happens with tree topping. We don't necessarily, there's not a cut made at a branch collar. All of those cuts, create some of that growth response that are those weakly attached stems Sarah was describing. So as those get larger over the years, then we have a bunch of weakly attached stems at a spot that has a lot of rot that's went into the trunk, and that's just a recipe for failure down the road. So while a freshly topped tree is not that much of a risk, boy, 10, 20 years down the road, sometimes even less, it's really at risk of storm damage. So topping trees is a big no-no.
Yep.
I have one question that I'm just going to ask you. I was getting ready to type it, but since I'm not a quick typist, recently we had a really heavy rainstorm. And on one of our main thoroughfares, I'm sitting here in Galesburg, Illinois, we had a mature tree that literally toppled over from the roots in an established neighborhood. What causes that? Is there anything that can be done to prevent that?
Well, I've definitely seen that where you have saturated soil combined with wind is not necessarily a good thing. And especially if there might have been health issues with that tree that we just don't know about. And then kind of back to site selection, was this in a yard? Was it in a, it sounds like it was.
It was right on the corner of Losey Street where the Christian Science building there.
So it could have a restricted
tree.
root space. It just might not have had enough room for that root space to grow. I recall working in St. Louis many moons ago, and they had a storm come in from the east. When the big red blob on the radar map comes in from the east, that's not good. And it was interesting to see all the tree failures, because where the roots had established to resist the predominant or prevailing winds that come from the north, northwest, southwest, saw a lot of smaller roots on the east side of the trees because it doesn't have to support as much wind load from that direction. And so we saw a lot of trees just right over from the root system. Now it's probably a separate fact, but I think, again, saturated soils, things float.
Possible, as you mentioned, site and species selection issues there. I don't know how mature the tree was, but it could have been something that doesn't care for poorly drained soils and wet feet too. So it could have been a factor in that. It was just it gave up at that point.
Well, I think it also goes back to some of what Sarah talked about in site selection and things, and in trying to think about at the time you're planting a tree, how big is the root zone going to be for this plant? And if it's got a driveway 10 feet from it, there's a good bet that root zone ends right at the driveway, because there's not significant moisture getting into the soil below that driveway. And so there's no reason for a tree to put roots into there. And that's where I see a lot of these blown over trees kind of happen, where there's something that's abruptly limited the development of the root system. And remember what Sarah said, that plant can have up to 3 to 5 times the spread of roots as it has above ground leaves or canopy spread. So something to plan for in tree planting for sure.
Well, I want to thank all three of you, Sarah, Chris, and Ryan. This has been a fabulous webinar. I want to thank everybody that hung out and remind you once again, it will be posted on the Eden website. And thank you for sharing all of your knowledge with us today.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for everybody for tuning in too.